Gentle listener, this is not a simple situation, not a direct or straightforward topic at all. For today, we are to cover one of the most interesting and thoroughly contrary of all the legions of loyalist space marines, and their sire, the Emperor's hammer, his very own son, the Primarch Ferrus Manus. Some say Ferrus Manus and his iron hands are not the most exciting of marines, the most respected, the most adored. No, they are not. But this is only because the Horus heresy has received the most attention from the Black Library. A shame in many regards, for they did not begin the tale with the Crusade. Because the start of the heresy, that terrible rebellion of the Warmaster, and a full half of the remaining legions of Space Marines, was where Ferrus Manus fell, and his legion was shattered. So they will never gain their full due, so to put it, as their light burned brightest in the period prior to the rebellion. But there is something that so many forget, so many ignore, so many do not even know. For when the chips were down, when the ultimate battle began, when the dread Warmaster turned his cloth and raised his banners to evil, when he did that, when he looked at the rosters of his brothers, the legions they commanded, their way of battle, their worth in war, Horus Lupercal, the greatest strategist of all the Primarchs outside of perhaps the Lion, the demigod left in charge of the Great Crusade, he judged well. For he sent the Angel and his sons into a trap. He cut off the hordes of the Ultramarines and their ever-astute Lord Guilliman. He sent the Lion as far away as he could possibly justify, he and the mighty fighting first. Yagatai Khan and his White Scars were also flung out into the stars. Leman Russ sent to slay his brother Magnus and all the 1,000 sons. Dawn, the Praetorian, was with the Emperor himself. He and his Imperial fists were out of Horus's reach. Yet when the battle came, when the stakes were at their highest, Horus placed before Ferrus Manus and his iron hands the best legion under his command, the Emperor's children. It was not mere irony or spite that made this decision. It was Horus's only choice. That, or his own legion. And he needed that in reserve. His Sons of Horus always would. For otherwise he could be dethroned by a pragmatic coup. Something he would not allow, as he knew his brothers were as craven as he. So he kept his men close, always. Corvus and his ravens are mighty. Vulcan and his salamanders the same. But neither of them had the experience, the combat veterans, the closeness to their armies that had been possible for Ferrus and his iron hands. For he was one of the first found of all the Primarchs, and he was one of the most bullish and belligerent of all the sons of the Emperor. He had led his men for centuries, had smashed Xenos and Horus on hundreds of worlds across the galaxy. They were a well-oiled and devastatingly powerful army. It was a tragedy for the Imperium that he was struck down, but let it never be forgotten that when he was undone, it was one of the very best that did it, all while enhanced by the dark powers of chaos. For they feared the Lord of the Iron Hands. They rightly feared him that much. For to many of the Primarchs, Ferrus would have seemed an older brother, a gruff and tough, no-nonsense Gorgon, as he had been dubbed. But he adored the name. He owned it. And it reflected his heritage of Medusa so well. And so, gentle listener, it is time we had a look at the dire and doleful events of the opening battles of the Horus Heresy again, but from the opposite ends. And we shall be discussing it from a slightly different angle. For so much stock is placed in the actions of the Primarchs, that I feel it denudes the real bravery and activity of those lesser beings, yet still so potent, the Space Marines themselves. For today, we discuss one of the leading lights of the mighty 10th Legion of the Legiones Astartes, the Emperor's own Angels of Death, his Space Marines, and in particular, these, his 10th Legion, his hammers, his iron hands. Now, I must let it be known that I do not consider this a Primarch entry. My apologies. We shall not be concentrating on Ferrus himself. I have my reasons, and one of them is that my old bones, which could be wrong, of course, but they feel that perhaps, just perhaps, there is something coming out on old Ferrus soon. I do not actually know why I have this feeling. Maybe it is just wish-casting, but I do honestly believe that more is coming for him soon, and I have performed an extensive entry on Fulgrim recently, so we shall take another path with this particular entry. We shall be looking at the Iron Hands, one of their greatest heroes, their history, and what they did after the Dropsite Massacre, when the Legion was shattered by base betrayal. For we shall be discussing one of the most important Astartes or Space Marines in that period. There are so many heroes, so many villains, so many figures, so many characters, and yet this one stands out. A man who became a name to be feared, a being hunted down by order of the Warmaster himself, and a massive fleet and army cut off from the rush towards Terra, just to quell the descent and guerrilla attacks of this man and the army he managed to forge out of the most unlikely of disparate collections of warriors of the Imperium. A man so important that he was even impersonated by Alpharius himself. He is one of only a handful of Marines to have orchestrated the injury of a Primarch, and few have ever done more to crack their mystique of invulnerability and near omnipotence on the battlefields of the HORUS Heresy. He was, in my mind, one of the most loyal and most ardent of all the Iron Warriors, and was, like Malcolm Ferrus, later, the true heart of the Iron Warriors, and what they should always have been. Of course, I can only be speaking of that ancient redoubtable, Shadrach Meduson. To quote, Shadrak Meduson was a Terran hailing from Old Albia, inducted into the 10th Legion. His service of at least 240 years, beginning in the later part of the Wars of Unification on Terra. His first actions as a legionary were as part of the 10th deployment in the Afric and Pan-Pacific regions, serving under Lord Commander Amadeus Duquesne. Duquesne would be Smythe's commander on several occasions, most notably at the Battle of Rust, and by the time of the Dropsite Massacre, the 10th Company captain would consider the original Legion Master one of his oldest friends. Smythe readily embraced the change that came upon the Legion with Ferrus Manus, their Primarch, was discovered and placed in command. He cast aside his Terran surname, as did many of the original Terran legionaries, and took up the name Meduson to demonstrate his firm allegiance to his new home world. Meduson took part in the Iron Hands battles of the Great Crusade, achieving such prominence that, for example, he was the officer assigned battlefield command of the Legion forces upon the world of 1544, whilst both Ferrus Manus and the first captain Gabriel Santar were absent from the line of battle. During this campaign, one of pacification against the inhabitants and hostile lifeforms of a world under the dominance of the Eldar, Meduson commanded the right flank of the Legion. His men used both as an anchor point and an assault force. As commander of the 10th Company, he acted as a mediator between his senior sergeant, Bion Henricos, and the other officers of the Primarch's Command Council when Sergeant Henricos suggested using their attached Imperial Army units as forward scouts, much to the disdain of the others. Meduson's temporary command of the Legion forces was successful. He was eventually able to locate the Eldar enemy's node complex that was the target of the mission, and came up with a battle plan that would ultimately prove victorious. Meduson's pre-battle organization was so well in hand that, when First Captain Santar returned to the line, he refused to take command, and instead left Meduson to enact his strategies, offering himself and his Morlocks as additional line troops for the assault. Meduson was present during the Battle of Isstvan V, but never set foot upon the world. Stationed aboard the Ironside, he was assigned to the Orbital Reserve, once again under the command of Duquesne, ready to drop as part of the Iron Hand's second wave. That moment never came, and instead Shadrach and his fellow warriors watched in horror from above as the massacre began. The situation quickly and clearly became untenable, the orbiting Iron Hands attempting to recover their ground forces, but were swiftly forced to defend themselves from ship-to-ship assaults and boarding actions launched by the Death Guard and the Sons of Horus. The Ironside was boarded in these moments, and Meduson led the defense. He and his crew were victorious, although Meduson himself was wounded by a stray plasma blast that made the latter amputation of his left hand necessary. Returning to the bridge, he was in time to receive the last transmission from Amadeus to Cain, informing him of the death of his father, Ferrus Manus. His old commander, referring to Shadrak as one of my storm walkers from the very start, Emperor's bloody own, urged Meduson. Tell the tents to raise the storm and take every last one of the bastards to hell. Duquesne's vessel then catastrophically exploded. Meduson's own ship was able to light its drives and power free from the orbital battle zone, but only just. With the death of Ferrus Manus, Gabriel Santar and Amadeus Duquesne, amongst others, as well as the scattering effect of multiple battle groups making different escape vectors from the Isstvan system, the Iron Hands as a legion were leaderless and demoralized. Shadrach Meduson found himself in one of the larger, if not largest, groups of Iron Hands, which had with it nearly all of the clan fathers of the legion. In the absence of a senior officer, the clan fathers announced that they would take temporary collective command. Meduson was not the lone voice, but the loudest that decried this move as pointless, being in favor of a singular leadership with a clear vision. Nevertheless, he acquiesced to the decision, following the lead of the senior member of his own clan present, Iron Father Jebez Org. The clan fathers determined to reorganize the legion along strictly traditional clan lines, although the ragtag nature of their forces resulted in one particular change. Clan Arverne was barely represented in the force, the majority of them being wiped out alongside the Primarch on the surface of Isstvan V, and could not form their own unit. Additionally, small units of Raven Guard and Salamanders had also been picked up during the escape, who needed to be fitted into the order of battle somewhere. The fathers decided, perhaps in response to Shadrak's admonition, that the Legion should work closely with their cousin legionaries into developing new ways of war instead of turning to old traditions, to fold the outsiders and the disgraced Arverne into Clan Sorgol. To make up for making Sorgol a mongrel clan, the fathers also made Jebez Org the war leader of the entire battle group. Org, in his turn, made Shadrak Meduson his hand-elect, his second in command. Not long after, the fleet received messages from another group of Iron Hands and altered course to meet them. Unfortunately, the meeting proved to be a trap laid by the Sons of Horus. In the naval battle that followed, the battle group flagship Crown of Flame was destroyed, taking the clan fathers with it. A vox signal was broadcast from the enemy's own flagship by their commander, Tybalt Mar, offering terms of surrender. Org's response was to take his own vessel, the Iron Heart, into close range with the enemy flagship and to order Meduson to board it and return with Mar's head. Meduson led his mixed legion and clan force for the first time in a teleport assault onto the Sons of Horus flagship, but despite fighting valiantly and causing much damage, his hybrid forces were forced to retreat before encountering Mar, as the Iron Heart itself took serious damage, and Jebez Org was injured beyond capability to command. Fleeing the area with a reduced force, Meduson found himself given the role of war leader by the incapacitated Org. Without the clan fathers, this resulted in Meduson suddenly gaining command over the whole force. Conferring with his commanders and the liaisons from the other legions, Shadrak Meduson determined that the Iron Hands would need to become flexible in order to not break under the pressure they found themselves. As his first act as war leader, Meduson announced his hand-elect. Breaking with tradition, he assigned the role to 4 individuals, not one. A representative each from Sorgol, Arverne, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard. His second pronouncement was to send out a wide-band message promising to Tybalt Mar that one day Shadrak Meduson would have his head. When questioned as to why he was attaching his name to the threat, Meduson outlined that, currently, the traitors did not fear the Isstvan survivors. How could they? By using one name again and again when striking and harassing them, he believed he would create an effect like that of a boogeyman. A morale blow that would aid their efforts and hamper the effectiveness of the enemy. Meduson then proposed a strategy that was a combination, an alloying of the Legion tactics of all those present. They would fight a guerrilla war, hit and run, but also seek to gather strength to their banner, and save what other survivors of the massacre and the rebellion that they could. Meduson's next confirmed appearance occurred not too long after the schism of the White Scars Legion. In the aftermath of that event, the surviving White Scars Marines that had moved against their Primarch were sent out as penitent warriors, grouping as kill teams to atone for their previous choice in righteous battle. One of those penitent kill teams was berthed aboard the captured Sons of Horus ship Grey Talon, captained by the aforementioned Bion Henricos, once Meduson's senior sergeant, and who had himself escaped Isstvan V, but separated from his company captain. Henricos and the White Scars kill team, led by Hibu Khan, ambushed another Sons of Horus vessel and attempted to capture it by boarding action. They met stiffer than expected resistance, however, and were only saved from death by the sudden appearance of Meduson and his own contingent of boarding troops. Meduson had been tracking Henricos' ship for some time, confused as to why a vessel that ostensibly appeared to belong to the Sons of Horus was operating according to an Iron Hand search pattern. The two colleagues appraised each other of events, and Meduson added Henricos and Hibu Khan's units to his ever-growing war. Indeed, by such time as the Battle of Dwell, Shadrach Meduson was reckoned to have assembled quite a significant force. Believed attached to his mongrel clan of original Isstvan V survivors were additional marine elements from the Salamanders and White Scars, numerous naval vessels, and apparently enough soldiery to total 58 full battalions of the Imperial army. The Battle of Dwell occurred mainly because Horus Lupercal wanted the planet for his own purposes, but also, in some small part, in order to deny its 8 million armoured troops from allying with Meduson's forces in the sector. Several Sons of Horus officers, notably Little Horus Aximand, suspected that Meduson may have already embedded men onto the planet, and this would prove to be true. At the culmination of the battle, a legionary Kell team who had been waiting to assassinate Lupercal found themselves out of position, and so settled for attempting to eliminate Horus Aximand and his command element instead. The resultant combat saw Bion Henricos perish, and Little Horus severely wounded. This was not the only assassination attempt masterminded by Shadrach Meduson on Dwell, however. In the aftermath of the battle, when the Primarchs Horus, Mortarion, and Fulgrim met to discuss their next moves, their conclave was attacked by a trio of Iron Hand's Fire Raptor gunships, heretofore hidden from detection and deployed likewise. This attempt was similarly unsuccessful, with the loss of all 3 of Meduson's birds, but all of the Primarchs and several of the other Marines present were wounded to some degree, some seriously. It is perhaps the closest currently known attempt to eliminate Horus, and all the more impressive for nearly removing multiple other essential personnel from the board as well. Following this event, and the baiting and destruction of an Iron Hand's ambush vessel further out in the Dwell system, Horus decided to detach a portion of his Legion resources and assign them to hunting down and destroying Meduson and his own band. This force was placed under the command of Captain Tybalt Marr, who felt he had a personal score to settle with the Iron Hand's war leader. No sightings of Meduson can be confirmed for the period immediately after the Battle of Dwell and the launching of Marr's hunter-killer force. The shadow network used by the Shattered Legions became filled with conflicting tales, either that he fought on still, or that he died either on Dwell or someplace else, caught by the Sons of Horus. Shadrach Meduson's identity was at some point taken by none other than Alpharius, Primarch of the Alpha Legion himself. Assuming the mantle of Meduson and garbing a unit of his own Marines in Iron Hand battle gear, Alpharius' disguise was completely undetectable by the members of the Iron Hand Legion he met. travelling in a vessel that appeared to be the Iron Heart, Meduson's own flagship. Alpharius fell in with a separate unit of mixed Isstvan survivor marines under the command of Cadmus Tyro, and convinced them, in his guise as Meduson, to aid him in an action against other members of the Alpha Legion. His deception was revealed towards the end of the affair, and the survivors of Tyros' force escaped with the knowledge that Alpharius had been impersonating Meduson. The real Shadrach Meduson still endured elsewhere in the galaxy, and was waging his guerrilla war against Horus with increasing brutality. However, Meduson's authority was usurped by the increasing madness and desperation in the Iron Hands. A coup by the cult of the Gorgon attempted to take control of Meduson's sizable Shattered Legion's force, proclaiming that they were led by the reborn Ferrus Manus himself. However, Vulcan, accompanying the fleet on his journey to Terra, quickly saw through the charade and revealed that the reborn Ferrus Manus to only be a mechanical puppet with one of the Primarch's metallic arms attached. Vulcan shattered the puppet in anger, and with that, the cult of the Gorgon crumbled. Despite their treachery, Meduson pardoned all of the Iron Fathers involved in the cult of the Gorgon, including his second-in-command, Jabez Org. Now in control of his force once more, but refused help from Vulcan, Meduson continued his war against Horus. He became engaged in an increasingly bitter struggle with Captain Tybalt Ma, who goaded him into open confrontation. Despite the advice of his Iron Fathers to avoid direct combat, Meduson openly fought Ma's larger fleet at the Battle of Arachna Chain. As the losses mounted, Meduson led a boarding action against Ma's flagship, Lupercal Pursuivant, but was ambushed and captured as Jabez Org abandoned him to his fate and withdrew with the remainder of the Loyalist fleet. Taken before Tybalt Ma, Meduson declared that the Iron Tenth would never be broken before he was decapitated by the Sons of Horus captain. And now we have heard the actions of just one of the Iron Hands heroes. It may be best for us to go on to discuss the effects of the heresy on the Iron Warrior's entire. For the rebellion of Horus was a lethality in purest form. As stated, he was in charge of the entire crusade. Every Primarch, every legion. Despite that he may be ignored and circumvented later in his play for power, at first, he held the reins of power close and tight. Before chaos broke many of his brothers, before it shattered his mind and left Horus a blubbering mound of jelly. Or so it seems right now. They have not finished the heresy, the siege of Terra. So much might change yet. Nothing is simple in the Horus heresy, and the truths we all held to as fact are now being revealed as based lies, used to aggrandize the Loyalists in the years after. Perhaps all interpretations are true. Perhaps the Horus heresy is in fact akin to the Time War of Doctor Who. Perhaps it is a million strands of possibility and chance that vary and change as the war progresses. All of the players are precognitive and able to counter each other again and again, rewriting history and causality, so this is not just one war, one battle, but a billion variations on the same themes and conflicts that are being played out simultaneously. Perhaps this is the reason for the seemingly offensively partisan or differing interpretations that are presented in the vast catalogue of the campaign thus far. Perhaps the image of the Emperor as the father, who does indeed love his wayward Primarchs, is an early version of himself, the one that is fighting the wars for the first time. He still respects and loves his sons, as it is projected in some of the books. And perhaps the tired and drained Emperor, the being that refers to his Primarchs as simply numbers and tools of war, is a far more beaten down Emperor from a later period. The Emperor who has witnessed 1,000,000 years of war, 1,000,000,000 permutations of the confrontation. One that has seen so many battles, wars and outcomes, that he is now shorn of his last vestiges of humanity, and any ability to conceptualize anything but the pieces on the board. Exhausted by the conflict on every level, yet still fighting it in a myriad realms. Perhaps the Emperor is in fact in contact with an almost infinite amount of alternate dimensions, fighting a never-ending confrontation across them all. When Guilliman met him, this seemed to be the situation at the least. A man so tired by his 10,000 years and more on the Holy Throne. A person that could be nothing but as insane as the beings it fights, the dark gods of chaos. One can see how he might turn cynical, have all love and laughter, all hope drained away. So much so that he sees nothing but the ranks of dead and the endless battles he inevitably loses. All in an attempt to, like Doctor Strange from the MCU, find the one strand of reality where he wins, where chaos and all of its machinations are finally beaten. And perhaps this is a trap that he has waltzed into, a cell for his own mind that has been constructed by the great schemer, Tzeentch. For only he has the subtlety and perspective to ever trap or fool the master of mankind. Only he. But then, perhaps all of this is just sophistry, as Ferrus would say, and that we will never know the truth, even at the siege's conclusion. An eventuality I find actually rather reassuring. The Horus heresy left scars so deep in the Iron Hands that even unto the 41st millennium, the era Indomitus, they were nearly destroyed by them. For I would like to briefly discuss Ferrus, how he affected his legion, where he would have taken them if he had lived. The Iron Hands are seen as some of the most brutal and cold of all loyalist marines. Their place amongst the crusade was high indeed. Ferrus Manus was not as tactically astute as the Lion or the Warmaster, not as flamboyant as his friend Fulgrim, nor as one-tracked as some of his later found brothers and their legions, like Dawn and his defences, or Yagatai and his speed. No, the Iron Hands were a legion that had a very specific form of warfare, but were adaptable enough to use this method against nearly any foe. For Ferrus Manus was trained by the Emperor himself, as were all of the early found Primarchs. Thus he took his star as the Lord of Humanity, was fast on the uptake. His Iron Hands were rugged and solid warriors, but their Primarch was so aptly named. He was called the Gorgon, by his friend Fulgrim at first, but then by most, at his own request. For he was uncompromising, unrelenting, untiring in his method of war. He also fought for something, and like so many of the later found Primarchs like Angron or Mortarion, he believed in the Crusade and its goals with all of his heart, as much as Rogel, as much as Horus, that much. And when he was betrayed by his best friend, his closest brother in all of the universe, asked to turn against the man he considered the saviour of humanity, his genetic father, it broke something inside him. Broke it badly. Ferrus Manus went to Isstvan with less than his full complement of men, in a mad dash to gain revenge, but also to clear his name. For he thought that his loyalist brothers would look ever askance at him, all because Fulgrim had tried to turn him. So he fathomed that many would see this as a chink in the armour, that Fulgrim would not have dared approach the Gorgon if there was not at least a crack in his loyalty that he could use. But let this sideline never detract from the main reason he was there. Yes, he wished to clear his name. Yes, he wished to strike down Horus and Fulgrim especially. But he was wrathful out of sheer sorrow. He had fought so long, fought so hard, been tireless in his action, redoubtable in his efforts and those of his legion. He was watching the death of a dream, and he could not understand why. He would never understand how the other Primarchs could raise arms against their father. He could not. And as so much of the setting revolves around the heresy, the civil war, it is difficult to fully understand why he was so loyal, until one takes even a few minutes out to walk just a few paces in the boots of those warriors who made up that great crusade. For the proof of the pudding is always in the tasting. The Emperor had stated that evil was everywhere, that humanity was being hunted and enslaved and culled by a galaxy that had turned on them. And he was right. He was right. Every single engagement of the Crusade brought more proof, more bloodshed and enslavement of our kind by the alien, the Xenos, the Witch and the Warped. As each crusading expeditionary fleet went out amongst the stars, they confronted these exact situations again and again and again. Mad psychers who had taken over great swathes of space, making all puppets, races that fed off humanity's flesh or its very souls. The Great Crusade was the vindication of the Emperor, for his assertions were utterly irrefutable. Humanity was being attacked by all. So Ferrus did not just think or believe he was righteous, that the regime of his father was good. He knew it. He witnessed it with every horror he ended, every planet he freed and scoured of the enemies of humanity. He knew he was right, and his father was also. He knew it. So to watch the brightest light, the greatest of all Primarchs, Horus, and then his favourite brother, one of only a score of people in the entire universe who could understand his experience, could live as he did, to watch them betray the Emperor and, as Ferrus reasoned it, humanity itself. It was too much. The few words belched from Fulgrim about their father betraying them, even were it true, would wipe away all of the good that he and his legion had done for humanity. Did these accusations stand against the horror that he had witnessed through hundreds of years of fighting these tyrants and monsters? No. 1,000 times no. Ferrus was loyal, and always would be. He was the Emperor's own hammer. He was loyal. But the rage he felt, it unmanned him. It dominated him more than the sight of Xenos or witches. For they were evil. They did not know any better. But Horus, Fulgrim, they were as close to the Emperor as any, closer even. And they had betrayed him. But unlike Dawn's white cold hate, Ferrus was a burning star blazing, and it killed him as much as the traitors did. For when the betrayal was finally revealed, when the Dropsite Massacre began, he could not accept it. Even with his genetically enhanced mind, his centuries of existence, he could not control his rage. In fact, when he died, when his head was finally taken from his shoulders by the power of a demonic blade in the hands of his friend, it birthed something horrible. A twisted mirror image of Ferrus in the warp, the Sapphire King. A detail we should get to another time in depth. But let it be known now that this was a demon of the warp feeding off the repressed emotions of Ferrus's sons. The guilt, the grieving, his iron hands' souls. For his sons reacted so desperately to his fall. They blamed his anger, his hot rage. They blamed the weakness of the flesh. And thus, they have ever after replaced body parts with iron, amputated without need to facilitate this, because they believe that the human elements of Ferrus Manus are what led to his death. They myopically blame their father, or even their allies of that day, the Salamanders and Raven Guard, for the tragedy that was purely the spite of the Dark Gods. And as they have internalized this blame, this shame, it was almost their undoing. Ferrus Manus, before these dire events, was a man of vision. He chose to act as he did, to get the job done. He did not lie to himself or his sons. One of my favourite quotes of Ferrus is thus: "Make war, and move on, and again, until nothing breathes which stands against us. All else is sophistry and pretty lies." He knew what he was about, what he needed to do, how he should do it. Ferrus knew his purpose. He was also at odds with his own legion. He understood that they venerated him, wished to emulate him, wished to become everything he asked them to be. But in many ways, he believed that they had strayed, that they had taken the wrong message from his very own life. For so many of his sons, his 10th Legion of Astartes, associated him with iron, with strength, with arms covered in metal that negated the need for the flesh beneath. They were strong because they were not human. That they were strong because they replaced those elements that made them weak. That they thought he despised all things of the flesh, merely due to his visage. His huge arms covered in necrodermis, his eyes changed so that they were silvered mirrors without pupil. They saw his strength and wished to emulate it. But this is what Ferrus actually thought about his men, his future and theirs. They are not my hands. This fact is forgotten by my brothers. Inexplicably, it has always seemed to me. The hands are strong, to be sure, and have created great things for us all. But they are not mine, and that counts for something. They forget that the silver on my arms comes from a beast that I vanquished. It is the mark of a great evil that I ended, and yet it persists within me. I would struggle to remove it now. I will not remove the silver from my flesh because I've learned to depend on it. The fault is with my mind. I rely on the augmentation given to me by my metal gauntlets, so much so that the flesh beneath them is now little more than a distant memory. A day will come when I will strip it from me, lest I lose the power to master myself forever. Already my legion's warriors replace their shield hands with metal in my honor, and so they too are learning to doubt the natural strength of their bodies. They must be weaned off this practice before it becomes a mania for them. Hatred of what is natural, of what is human, is the first and greatest of the corruptions. So, I record it here. When the time comes, I will strip my hands of their unnatural silver. I will instruct my legion to recant their distrust of the flesh. I will turn them away from the gifts of the machine, and bid them relearn the mysteries of flesh, bone, and blood. When my father's crusade is over, this shall be my sacred task. When the fighting is done, I shall cure my legion and myself. For if fighting is all there is, if we may never pause or reflect on what such devotion to strength is doing to us, then our compulsion will only grow. Already I see the madness the path leads to, and so I shall exorcise the silver from my hands. In doing so, I shall weaken myself and my sons, but nonetheless, it must be done. The hands are strong. They have created great things, but they are not mine. Attributed to Ferrus Manus, from the Nymeral Scrolls. And in the years since, the Iron Hands had repressed all of their emotions, in an attempt to expunge the weakness they felt led to the defeat of their lord. Yet it was this that near destroyed them. Only by surrendering to their rage, embracing their humanity and their passions again, did they prevent their extermination at the hands of the Sapphire King. But that is definitely a tale for another time. The shame of the entire situation is that Ferrus was lost when needed most. There can be no mistake, no error in the view that Horus knew his most dangerous enemies. He may have sent Fulgrim to Ferrus Manus to fail, as I've previously considered, or he may well have just looked at the Gorgon, his legion, his power, and allowed his lust for this army to completely blind him to the inexorable truth. Ferrus would never turn. Thus, some of the most dangerous armies to the Warmaster were brought to Isstvan to be annihilated. The Raven Guard would ever be a thorn in any enemy's side. At full legion strength, they could have crippled the advance of the traitors. They had to go. The Salamanders were tough and far too humane to ever turn. They too would have to go. But if ever there was one person that the entire Isstvan Massacre was arranged to kill, one legion that Horus knew he had to exterminate as soon as possible, it surely must have been Ferrus Manus and his iron hands. Imagine the drudge that would have been the advance towards Terra if the Iron Hands had been alive. Imagine the increased horror of the siege of Terra if it had been Ferrus and his men who stood next to the Blood Angels and the Imperial Fist in those last days. Imagine what mounds of dead that would have been required to take a wall manned by these Astartes. Near as stoic as the Imperial Fist, it would have been near impossible for Horus to crack the egg. I honestly believe that the Isstvan Dropsite Massacre, one of the most brutal battles ever fought in the heresy, a battle that was so complex and overwhelming that mortal warriors who witnessed it lost their minds, was set up to kill one man and his legion. The rest were just bonuses. It was set up to remove Ferrus and his sons from the game. Yet despite the death of their Primarch, the slaughter of the flower of their legion, the Iron Hands never surrendered. They did not mope back to Terra, whine at the master of mankind as Corvus did. They continued the fight, and mere Astartes against gods. They even managed to bring fear into the hearts of the traitor Primarchs. Managed to wound multiple of these demigods of war. And this is why I will always respect the Iron Hands. No, they will never be my favourite legion. No, they will never be the most glamorous or lauded of loyalist legions. But that does not matter. None of it matters. Because for those who know, for those who understand, for those who can channel their way of war and lead them on the field of glory, surely there are none who can state that they are more worthy than the Emperor's own hammers. His iron hands. I have been Baldermort. I would like to thank HORUS Heresy Legions for this opportunity to present the Iron Hands of the Heresy era. And of course, the major campaign they are running at the present revolves around the Isstvan Dropsite Massacre. And of course, the heroes Shadrach Meduson, Gabriel Santar, the only man to ever be able to calm his father, Ferrus Manus. So follow the links in the description and take a front row seat in the events of the HORUS Heresy. See if you could do any better if you were in charge of this mighty group of warriors and their shattered legion allies. And now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.